First off, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to present at the K-Quarantine Expo 2020. This has been an unprecedented pandemic year, and while many countries continue to struggle with the disease, South Korea has been one of the more successful countries in dealing with the outbreak while avoiding widespread lockdowns. Over the past 10 months, several countries have slowly returned to a level of normalcy while others still grapple with increasing number of cases. Most experts believe that only an effective COVID-19 vaccine will end the pandemic. And this has led to the accelerated development of new vaccine candidates, some of which are in phase 3 clinical trials. Some of the candidates represent new approaches distinct from classical and previous vaccines. And it seems highly likely now that several of candidates that are currently in phase 3 clinical trials will be available early next year. Their rapid development may pave the way to shorten future response times when new viruses emerge. However, many unknowns remain in the details of rapidly employing such a new vaccine to the global population. So my presentation today is broken down and outlined as follows. First, I'll mention the COVID-19 outbreak and impact, global response to develop a new vaccine. I'll highlight several vaccine approaches and classical and new platforms, and the challenges and hurdles that remain for a new COVID vaccine, as well as the outlook for new vaccines and future outbreaks. So in December 2019, and potentially earlier, although unrecognized, SARS-CoV-2 emerged as a pneumonia-causing disorder in Hubei province in China. Since then, it was identified as a new coronavirus with the ability to infect humans with the potential for causing severe respiratory disease. It's believed to have originated in bats and then transmitted to humans via an intermediate host, like previous coronavirus outbreaks. The coronavirus rapidly spread worldwide since January 2020, and there are currently over 32 million cases across 215 countries and over almost 1 million deaths to date. The emergence of SARS-CoV-2 was not totally unexpected, given that earlier outbreaks of H5N1, SARS, H1N1, MERS, and Ebola raised the global awareness of that such pandemic diseases could arise, but that still led to many countries being caught off guard and unprepared, as many failed to develop mitigation plans and resorted to government lockdowns to mitigate that basically debilitated economies for many weeks. So the collateral damage of the outbreak was considerable to global economies. And many businesses and recreational sectors were hard hit due to these government-imposed lockdowns. However, we're now at a stage where the economic output seems to be rapidly recovering after lifting of the lockdown measures. But restoring confidence in people is going to be essential because they need to feel relatively safe in their daily lives, and it will be key to see how successfully economies recover in the future. People need to learn to live safely with the virus, which means we need effective interventions such as vaccines, diagnostics, and drugs. A successful vaccine would be able to protect the population from COVID-19 and help normalize our daily lives. Combating the virus primarily includes repurposing marketed drugs or those in late-stage development, such as remdesivir, and repurposing that also extended to some biopharmaceuticals to manage disease. And this included immune-mediated inflammatory disease or anti-cytokine treatments. However, a vaccine for COVID-19 remains the best option to prevent the spread and end the pandemic. So the WHO recently released a target product profile for COVID-19 vaccine. And a target product profile, or TPP, is essential for vaccine developers as it defines the optimal or minimal characteristics for a new vaccine. Any product that fails to meet the minimal requirements will likely not have an impact on the disease and would be a waste of resources. So the progression of COVID-19 vaccine candidates into the clinical development phases can be used to provide some insights that may be useful for informing future COVID vaccine development efforts, as well as vaccine R&D strategies for other vaccine development. The TPP also provides guidance for clinical trial design, implementation, evaluation, and follow-up. Ideally, the vaccine must have no or limited contraindications and must be widely administered to all populations. It must also be efficacious and safe, and herd immunity and transmission blocking will also depend on this broad immunization and will have to likely include children and pregnant women. Herd immunity for COVID-19 would require a vaccination of about 67% of the global population. And ideally, it should be given as a single dose, but not more than 2 doses, and perhaps a booster for healthcare workers could be acceptable and should protect people for at least a year. The vaccine should also have high thermostability to enhance its distribution and availability in low-middle income countries. This next slide shows that there has been no precedence for the rapid development of a new vaccine. This timeline shows the development of various vaccines for Ebola virus and 3 beta coronaviruses, including SARS-CoV-2. On the left side of each timeline is a reference point for each type of viral infection, and significant events are depicted along the timelines, although it's not according to scale. The red horizontal bars indicate the approximate period from the first outbreak vaccine to clinically approved use, and dotted red lines indicate that no availability of vaccine since the first outbreak has been available, while the green dotted line represents a rapid emergency use or authorization timeline for putative SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. So you can see that SARS-CoV-2 is the latest in a series of, not only latest in the series of emerging viruses, but it's also an example of a vaccine that was quickly developed in under a year, even if it was for rapid emergency use. The previous examples of the 2 coronavirus outbreaks, SARS-CoV-1 and MERS, was started, but to date there has been no vaccine approved for either. And much of the vaccine development work fizzled out after resolution of the diseases. The vaccine for Ebola was only recently approved after 15 years of development and followed the worst outbreak in Africa in 2014 to 2015 with over 28,000 cases. And this actually represents the normal flow of vaccine development. So given the worldwide magnitude of the COVID-19 pandemic and comparisons to the Spanish flu of 1918, the race for a vaccine candidate has taken on unprecedented urgency and commitment across the globe. So there are multiple vaccine strategies used for SARS-CoV-2, and most of these vaccines under development employ one of the following approaches. The subunit vaccine candidates target 1 or more viral proteins as antigens. There's whole virus vaccines that reflect well-known vaccines that can result in a strong and lasting immune response. There are nucleotide-based vaccines that add a new piece of genetic material, either DNA or RNA, to a specific immune cells in our body. And these targeted cells are then often a type that are able to absorb and break down a virus or bacteria, and then display the virus or bacteria to lymphocytes, which learn to recognize this antigen. The viral vaccines are modified viruses into vaccines that contain their own RNA or DNA, but are also a piece of RNA or DNA from the other virus. All pieces of nucleic acid material can work as an antigen. So the cells in our immune system will react to the vector virus as well as part to the virus vaccine to develop immunity. So the nucleotide, subunit, and vector base, as well as attenuated, inactivated forms, have already been demonstrated for their prophylactic efficacy against MERS and SARS, and this has been used to help jumpstart the development of a safe and effective vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. The next slide shows an overview of the various vaccine platforms in development against COVID-19. A schematic representation is shown on the classical vaccine platforms that are commonly used for human vaccines, as well as the next generation platforms. Classical vaccine platforms, such as virus-based vaccines, can consist of inactivated virus that is no longer infectious or live attenuated viruses. Since whole inactivated viruses do not replicate, adjuvants are required to stimulate the immune system. There are protein-based vaccines that can consist of a protein purified from the virus or virus-infected cells, and recombinant protein or virus-like particles. They usually require an adjuvant as well to elicit a strong immune response. There are virus-like particles consisting of structural viral proteins necessary to form a virus particle but lack the viral genome and non-structural proteins. Several COVID-19 vaccines based on these classical platforms are currently in clinical trials, and one based on whole inactivated virus with one and another consisting of recombinant protein. The main advantage of next generation approaches is that they can be developed rapidly based on sequence information alone, and thus represent a shorter time to development. Nucleic acid-based vaccines can be adapted quickly when a new virus emerges, which is why these were among the very first COVID-19 vaccines to enter clinical trials. There are also artificial antigen-presenting cells where COVID-19 antigens are displayed and used as a vaccine. These next-generation approaches are highly adaptable and speeds up vaccine development considerably. That's clear from the fact that a large number of COVID-19 vaccines involve these next-generation platforms. Much of the time and effort for the development of new vaccines is the clinical development stage and can normally take up to 6 to 8 years. The accelerated timelines for COVID-19 was achieved by shortening these clinical development phases by first establishing efficacy at each phase on successfully larger populations. However, continuous safety monitoring is going to be required at each stage beyond registration. However, this will not impede the development of the vaccines unless significant adverse effects are observed. Recently, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in phase 3 was halted last month for about a week due to an AE in a patient, but quickly restarted again shortly afterwards. So the next slide just summarizes some of the most advanced COVID-19 vaccines. I've highlighted them here as the University of Oxford's AstraZeneca's vaccine, which is a viral vector vaccine currently in phase 3 that was started in end of August in the US and UK. There's a Sinovac biotech vaccine that was which is an inactivated SARS-CoV-2 and approved for emergency use in China. There's Moderna's vaccine, which is an mRNA vaccine, and which was first tested in humans in March, and phase 3 in July was started in July and enrolled about 30,000 patients in the US. CanSino Biologics and the Beijing Institute of Biotechnology also has a viral vector vaccine, or weakened adenovirus, and this is in phase 3, and testing is ongoing outside of China, and it's approved for use on military personnel. Sinopharm also has an inactivated SARS-CoV-2, and it has already been dosed under an emergency use program in hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers and select populations in China. The Pfizer-BioNTech Fosun Pharmaceutical RNA-based vaccine began their expanded phase 3 clinical trial in September and will be administered to about 44,000 people. J&J and Janssen pharmaceutical companies have an adenosine 26 weakened adenovirus and given to volunteers as a single dose. The phase 3 trial was started in September 23 and will enroll up to 60,000 volunteers across multiple countries. And finally, the Novavax NVX-CoV2373 is a recombinant nanoparticle vaccine made up of several different S proteins as an immune boosting as well as an immune boosting adjuvant. And phase 3 for this started in September 24th in the United Kingdom, and this will enroll up to 10,000 volunteers. So many of these vaccine candidates will probably reach approval by early 2021, which is a rather unprecedented achievement and a testament to how rapidly we can develop a vaccine in response to a global pandemic. What will remain to see once one or more of these vaccines reach approval is how many doses can actually be produced and who will receive these vaccines first. Most manufacturing capability has already been reserved for COVID-19, with most developers signing agreements with many CMOs. It is unclear how this will affect the supply of other essential vaccines as well. One issue that remains to be addressed is how effective the vaccine will be in low middle income countries, as access to these vaccines can be challenging if there's a reliance on multiple doses or cold chains. So it will be interesting to see the development of new delivery technologies alongside or as a close follow-up to many of these vaccines for use in low middle income countries. So one of the ways we can ensure that the vaccines become accessible to everyone is through COVAX, which is one of the 3 pillars of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator launched in April by the WHO, European Commission, and France in response to the pandemic. This creates incentives for manufacturers for large-scale capacity to guarantee enough production of a COVID-19 vaccine. It's in line with various global organizations that have come forward to expedite this process, such as Gavi, CEPI, and the WHO. More importantly, it allows global access to vaccines through manufacturers' short-term commitments to minimal pricing and manufacturing them at quantities needed to end this crisis. And in doing so, this will ensure that the ability to pay does not become a barrier to accessing these vaccines. So locally, SK Bioscience will produce Novavax nanoparticle S protein vaccines for domestic markets and global markets. And they will also produce the AstraZeneca vaccine for a price of $5 per dose and predict a 750 billion Korean won sales projected. So despite the availability of vaccines at the beginning of next year, some hurdles remain to ensure that the vaccine has the desired impact on stopping the spread of the disease and thus the return to normalcy. Some of these are highlighted on this slide. First of all, no one has vaccinated 8 billion people before. This is unprecedented, and there's also a case of prioritization, which populations to vaccinate first. There's also logistical challenges associated with overcoming cold chain and cargo limitations. And there are also unknowns associated with the specific vaccines in terms of multiple doses or whether or not boosters will be required. There's also vaccine nationalism, which is when a country manages to secure doses of vaccines for its own citizens or residents and prioritizes its own domestic markets before they are made available to other countries. This occurs through pre-purchasing agreements between governments and vaccine manufacturers. For example, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the European Union have spent tens of billions of dollars on deals with vaccine frontrunners such as Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, even before the effectiveness of these vaccines have been proven. There's also vaccine hesitancy, also known as the anti-vaccination movement. This is a reluctance or refusal to be vaccinated or to have one's children vaccinated against a contagious disease despite the availability of a vaccine. This was identified by the World Health Organization as one of the top 10 global health threats of 2019. About half the US population have said they will not take a COVID-19 vaccine, even if it becomes available. I mentioned that continuous safety will be essential for monitoring the vaccine as it gets distributed to larger and larger populations. And in the US, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is a surveillance program co-sponsored by the FDA and the CDC. And a program like this could be administered to a larger population or worldwide other countries as well to make sure that there are no adverse events that are seen in a global, wider population. And finally, we want to make sure that we avoid coverage gaps. And this is based on the experience of the rotavirus vaccine, which was approved in 2007 and which had good coverage in the US. However, approved for WHO use in 2019, its worldwide coverage 10 years on was only 40% of the children received the entire 3 doses. So the outlook for COVID-19 is really based on our current response. This current global approach to COVID-19 will set a new precedents for responding to future outbreaks. And we stand to learn a number of things in the coming months. For example, we'll know for sure if a COVID-19 vaccine is safe and effective. And we'll also learn that it's possible to develop a new vaccine in 12 to 18 months. We will know if we will be able to produce enough high-quality vaccines at an affordable price. And we'll learn also how to ensure vaccine access and equity globally. So this is important in terms of looking to the next pandemic. And COVID-19 is really just a harbinger of things to come and highlights the threat of emergence and how quickly a new disease can spread. The humanitarian and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic cannot be the normal response to future outbreaks, and we need to further refine our processes to improve our response to rapidly developed disease interventions. Finally, I would like to end with highlighting some of the Korean companies with active research programs on COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. Multiple approaches are represented here in this slide. And more importantly, these approaches can be quickly adapted and implemented to future disease outbreaks. This can have a benefit for the self-sustainability of South Korea and Korean industry. So I mentioned earlier that it is very likely that in the next year we'll have 2 to 3 vaccines available, and that the rapid pace of clinical development is unprecedented and really has been used to validate the next generation approaches that can be quickly employed in response to disease outbreaks. And I believe that the lessons learned from this COVID-19 will finally impact how nations and the global community respond and manage to future outbreaks. Thank you for your attention.